How do you start a story? What's the best way to begin so that your reader will be interested enough to carry on reading your book? Hello Space Cats, I'm Jules, writer and illustrator of children's books, and I make videos on drawing and publishing every week. Like and subscribe if that interests you, because my channel is jam-packed with that kind of stuff. In the description box below you will find a free guide to publishing that will help you with some of your writing. This week we are looking at how to make killer beginnings. Let's imagine that you have the ideas for your plot and your characters, but you have been procrastinating because you just can't think of a great way to start your story. Well, firstly, I would just say start somewhere. You can always go back and edit your first lines, and quite frankly, you probably will. The worst thing is just staring at a blank piece of paper or that empty screen, so just start somewhere. What you're trying to achieve is writing a first line that makes your reader want to learn more. The first lines should really introduce you to the character or the setting or the mood or perhaps a conflict that's going to start your story. It should make the reader ask questions. In George Orwell's 1984, he talks about the clocks striking 13. His description of the day shows us the context and the setting, but the clock striking 13 is distinctly odd. Raising conflict is where a character is doing something that they wouldn't normally do according to their nature. In Astrid Lindgren's Pippi Longstocking, she describes our hero Pippi, who lives in her house on the outskirts of town, but then we learn that she's only 9 years old. The conflict in the reader's mind is, how can a 9-year-old live on her own? Pippi is going to be about the same age as most of the readers. They are likely to be living in a family home or a house with other people. So the reader is going to be wondering what has happened to Pippi to enable her to live on her own, and what exciting adventures is she going to get up to now she's living under her own rules. First lines can also give an indication of the tone and the narrative voice. For example, in Neil Gaiman's Fortunately the Milk, the story is written in first person, so we can hear the character's thoughts and feelings. In his first lines, he's looking into a pretty empty fridge, but he's also thinking about how his sister eats a very weird combination of foods sometimes. You could take a look at C.S. Lewis's The Voyage of the Dawn Treader. Here we learn about a boy called Eustace Clarence Scrubb, and the first lines tell us that something awful is going to happen to him. Eustace is a secondary character really, and the primary characters in the story don't really think very much of him. Certainly not to start with. But the reader is going to be thinking, well, what is it that he deserved almost? It's a kind of foreshadowing of doom to come. Some people start with imagery, perhaps a place, an item, or a feeling. For example, in Kieran Larwood's The Dark Hollow, he opens with a description of the bard, who's one of the main characters. We discover that he has terrible nightmares and that he's tiptoeing around a dark warren in the middle of the night. So how can this work in practice? What tips can I give you for starting your story? Well, you could start it with the setting. If you go and have a look at the first Harry Potter book, The Philosopher's Stone or The Sorcerer's Stone if you're in the US, these first couple of lines set out the theme of pride in the Dursley family. It gives us an indication of where they live and what their values are, and how this kind of conflicts with what Harry's like. So you could try making your first line something to do with the setting that your character's in. Where does the story start? What year is it? What time of year is it? What can your characters hear or see or sense? You could have someone speaking the first line. That could be something that sets up a link in the whole story. Or it could tell us something about the character and who they are. For older children, it could be a dialogue of something a bit strange, like with the clocks that struck 13. Perhaps they're having a conversation with somebody. Perhaps they're just talking to themselves. But make sure that first line of dialogue actually does some work for you. Don't waste time just giving some flannel. Alongside dialogue, you could have a character thinking something. This has the benefit that we, the reader, might know something that nobody else in the book knows. We can hear the protagonist, what they're thinking or feeling. That helps the reader to invest in the story because we are already part of the story from page 1. Onomatopoeia. That's a sound associated with an action. Perhaps you could start your story with a sound. Bang, as the door slams shut. Or a scream. Ah! Or a laugh. Or a whoosh as a car goes past. Try to imagine what sort of sounds you would use if you were shooting your story as a film. What would the sound effects be? Could you use that in your first line? A statement of something surprising or out of the ordinary. If you've ever read Lemony Snicket, you will know that the first line tries to put the reader off reading the book. He says, if you're after a happy ending, don't bother reading the book. Now that to me is a bit like if I say to you, do not, under any circumstances, think about elephants. What do you think of? So in Lemony Snicket, we want to find out what happens in the ending because the writer has told us we won't want to know. Weird psychology. Anyway, it's quite intriguing for the reader because they want to find out what happens in the end. But perhaps your beginning might have something really strange happening. Maybe your first line might be, it was the dead mouse that made me think of Aunt Madge. By the way, that's just off the top of my head. I am not quoting anyone directly. Time. You could use the time of day. Perhaps it's getting dark and little Jimmy is supposed to be at home. Maybe it's 7 a.m. and the alarm clock's going off. Or you could use the time of year. Perhaps the snow is falling for the first time this year. When you're thinking of first lines, if you're writing for a picture book, you are going to need to be like a greyhound out of the gate. Your story needs to start on page 1, quite literally. For picture books, you have less than 1,000 words to tell your story, so every single word is going to need to work for its place in your book. Page 1 needs to tell the reader who they're reading about and what the story is going to be about. A great example, and one of my favourite books, is Oliver Jeffers' The Incredible Book-Eating Boy. Now, I have to say, the title does give us a little bit of a spoiler as to what the story is about, but it's also really intriguing. Go and find a copy in your nearest library or go and buy a copy. It's a real inspiration to have a look at that book. What the first 15 words tell us is that Henry is kind of like us, but not quite. What is quite normal? What does that mean? We know who the character is. He's called Henry. We can see from the pictures that he's a child, and we know that he's a bit like us in some ways. But in another way, he's not. Well, of course, the title gives us kind of a big clue, but I'm going to give you a massive spoiler alert. So if you don't want to know, stick your fingers in your ears and don't lip read for about 30 seconds. Oliver Jeffers could have written, Henry loved eating books. There you go, 4 words that tell us exactly who it is and what the story's about. But that's a little bit dull. By making those first 3 quite short sentences ambiguous, it makes us curious as to who is this Henry and why does he eat books? Okay, you can take your fingers out of your ears now. Another one of my favourite authors is Alex T. Smith, and his take on Little Red Riding Hood is called Little Red and the Very Hungry Lion. Instead of it being a wolf in the story, it's a lion. And instead of that character being fierce and ferocious and ready to rip your face off, he's goofy and, well, a bit of a twit. Right from the very first line, we learn that Little Red has no intention of being that lion's dinner. And the foreshadowing shows us that she is gonna sort him out. In both of these books, it's the images that help us understand the story. In Little Red, if you saw her as a character that was hiding away in a cupboard, desperate not to be seen, then the reader might think, yep, she's gonna get eaten. But because we can see that she's happy and confident and the lion looks, well, a bit ridiculous, then we know she's going to be okay. This text is funny because there is this conflict between the 2 characters. And in The Incredible Book-Eating Boy, it's what Henry's doing in the pictures that makes us understand the text. And remember, the child that is reading the picture book is really reading the pictures. It's the adult who is supplementing the story with the words. People often ask me what is my favourite book that I've written, and I can never answer that question because it's kind of like saying which is your favourite child. However, a useful page for this discussion belongs to Flossie Bonds. Flossie and her best friend Evie had just had some bad news. Father Christmas was ill in bed with a bad cold. His head ached. He felt hot and he had a sore throat. Poor Father Christmas. This introduces us to the two girls and shows us what the conflict is straight away. The image shows us that it's Christmas time, and the idea of Father Christmas being out of action on Christmas Eve is something that small children can identify with. It sets up the problem. What will happen if Father Christmas can't deliver Christmas presents on Christmas Eve? In picture books, there is a marriage between text and illustration. Both have a vital role and need one another. If you are someone who writes and illustrates, that kind of helps make things a little bit easier sometimes, because you're going to be thinking about things not only as words as a story, but also what it's going to look like on the page. But if you're someone who writes the text, then you also need to consider what's going on the page, because that will help tell the story, even if it's just a vague idea. Well, I hope that has given you a few pointers for good story beginnings. If you really can't think of a perfect way to start your story, then just write something and tell yourself it's the temporary first line. Next week I'll be looking at killer endings. So if you're looking for a good way to end your story, join me then. Until then, I'm off to put on my winter onesie and hibernate. I will see you next time. Nanu nanu!